So it is my great pleasure today to introduce docent Antti Lampinen. So you're a docent in classics and an expert in ancient ethnographical, historiographical, geographical writings, and currently collegium researcher at the Turku Institute for Advanced Studies, working on a project on the later receptions of ancient ethnographical writing. So.
Thank you so much, Malin. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. It's also a pleasure to be in Málaga and wonderful to be talking about these sort of things.
Yeah, it's a great pleasure to have you here. And the reason we had the honor to invite you is that you are giving a keynote lecture at the seminar, The People and Its Enemies, Classical and Contemporary Perspectives on Logics of Exclusion, that I'm organizing here together with Tomás Pacheco-Bethencourt from the University of Málaga. Your keynote lecture is on the physiognomist Polemo, right? And you are going to talk with the title, What's Wrong with Polemo? Thinking about ethnic discrimination in the life and writings of the notorious physiognomist. So I would love to start by asking some main points maybe that you could share about your lecture, but before that we could contextualize the lecture a little bit to the listeners. So first of all, who was Polemo?
Well, Polemo, who I have chosen to denote as Notorious Physiognomist in my title, simply for the sake of maybe being a bit more able to play with my by now quite long acquaintance with this figure. I have been studying Polemo maybe for the past 10 years, more or less, and because of his complex influence, the complex afterlife of his text, and genuinely just his very strange personality, I chose to speak in this Málaga event about also his personality and choices, perhaps. So Marcus Antonius Polemo, or if we give the Greek name Marcos Antonius Polemon, was a sophist, so a rhetorician, philosopher, speaker, political influencer, one might say, a lobbyist even, in his own era, in the 2nd century CE, roughly around the time of Emperor Hadrian's rule, who hailed from provincial Asia Minor, from the borderlands between Phrygia and Lycia, but who made a very dazzling, wealthy career as a super high-profile speaker in the highest echelons of the Roman Empire, hobnobbed with the elite, with the current and future emperors, was a teacher to many, an implacable enemy for many others, and among his various output, let's say, there is also this handbook of physiognomical analogies and interpretations, which unfortunately is lost in its original Greek form, but from which we have several reflections, both a Latin pastiche or Latin abbreviation, a Greek epitome, both from late antiquity, and then a very vibrant Arabic reception from early Middle Ages and High Middle Ages. And this has been now used to reconstruct the essence and the main argument of Polemo's physiognomy since 2007, roughly. And this forms my basis as well for engaging with Polemo, and I thought, since we have a very beautiful transhistorical perspective to the conference, I thought it will be very interesting to interrogate Polemo's own context, his intellectual makeup, intellectual formation in his own context, plus his political and personal agendas for being such a, well, for lack of a better term, a nasty piece of work. He really does not seem to have been a very nice person. So that's what I'm going to speak tomorrow.
I really look forward to it. And to tell you the truth, I was reading this Polemo's treatise last night, and my impression seems to correspond with what you are saying. But so first of all, let's give a definition. So this treatise is on the art or knowledge template or theoretical framework, one could say maybe practical know-how of physiognomy, which was this ancient way of basically assuming an intricate correspondence between the physical looks and the psychological characteristics and so on, and combined with a whole lot of animal analogies also in Polemo. So what was physiognomy for
Well, physiognomy, indeed. The way Polemo looks at physiognomy, which is, by the way, a very vibrant tradition in other traditions as well, except the Greco-Roman one. We do have evidence of Mesopotamian and Indian physiognomies even earlier than the Greek one. But by the time Polemo wrote his physiognomical handbook, physiognomy was already living in its let's say, second golden era. The first golden era arguably could have been in the Hellenistic age, when, once again, it's easy to say that, easy to see that the Greek world was opening up, encountering lots of other groups of people, lots of different variation in the human diversity, which seems to have generated a sort of Hellenistic first golden age of physiognomy. By Polemo's time, it was pretty established. Very few authors, although there are some, very few authors in his own cultural sphere were expressing lots of skepticism of physiognomy. And those who do might have been actually expressing skepticism because of Polemo, because he was widely hated character as well as very well linked one. So Polemo was in an intrinsically, pardon the pun, polemic context. He wrote his physiognomy as a handbook and a weapon for any speaker. He wanted to imply that physiognomy is a techne. It is an ars in Latin speech, but from a Greek point of view, it is a techne which is predictive, just as well as an oracular or divination. Oracular practices or divination is predictive, and that it had a solid theoretical background. Physiognomy had an experimental base of practicing it, and Polemo essentially wanted to codify in an extremely personal and slightly politicized climate, I would say, and for motives of his own, he wanted to codify this existing knowledge framework in a way which also corresponded to his own agendas, which were, I would argue, surprisingly nativistic. We live in an era when usually the way we have been learning about the second century is that the Roman Empire was bringing lots of peoples together. Its big cities had a huge variety of human diversity in the street life, everyday life. Everybody was able to become a Roman because of the citizenship being open to everybody. And it is interesting that in this context we see a pool, a clique, a lineage of very influential Greek speakers, sophists would be the usual term, becoming very influential, becoming very close, getting very close to the ears of the emperor, and all of them quite systematically, or at least semi-systematically, promoting this idea that Greekness is not actually something you can learn, which is usually what we have almost conventionally thought about post-Hellenistic Greekness, is that everybody could become Greek if you learn Homer, if you learn the language, if you learn rhetoric, a cultural Hellenicity, if you will. And then in Polemo's group, there was a significant pushback to this. Polemo seems to argue that you have to be born a Greek, and true Greeks can be recognized from their looks, and they are automatically somehow better and superior than the other inhabitants of the empire. So this actually was what got me into studying Polemo's physiognomy in the first place, because the counterfactual that, unlike what we have learned to believe about the second century, it seems that there was a significant Greek pushback which sought to, in a way, delimit the borders, the boundaries of Greekness back into something that is almost Periclean. It is almost classical Athenian in its super nativistic understanding of what it is to be Greek.
And so how the physiognomy works is basically that you are reading the face to make interpretations or draw conclusions of the inner characters and capacities.
Exactly. Yes, it is basically always presented as a predictive techne, which by reading semeia, so signs of the body, it can draw conclusions of the soul, of the hidden parts of the human person, usually through three different kinds of analogy. There are animal analogies, which are very common, and of course we do know how popular animal fables, such as those of Aesop, were in antiquity. And indeed this was something which everybody was learning from childhood onwards. You started to learn thinking through animal allegories and analogies from very early onwards. So this is a very efficient cultural pool into which you can kind of anchor your readings, physiognomical interpretations. The second great analogy were ethnic analogies, and these are particularly something which interests me, coming from the study of ethnography and study of ethnic stereotypes in antiquity. And these, similarly, were very popular, very instinctive, and had, it seems, kind of intrinsic plausibility because they never need to be explained. It seems that all the physiognomical arguments could take it for granted that the audience would more or less know. Well, you can say about this curly-headed person that they are like a Syrian or they are like Egyptian, and as we all know, that's the implication, as we all know, Syrians are like this and Egyptians are like this. So hence you can physiognomize a curly-headed person as somebody who exhibits purely stereotypical traits, which the audience had started to associate with Syrians or Egyptians, for instance. And this is typical analogy from the ethnic point of view. Northern barbarians with their blonde hair, blue eyes, reddish skin, where, and after all, we are in Málaga, so reddish skin of the northerners is very much in evidence in here, etc. The third type of analogy was basically based on typical human sentiments or physical expressions of states, mental states, such as, if a person has a scowl on their forehead, they tend to look like an angry person, hence it can be physiognomized that their character tends towards anger. These all three analogies were present from early on, from the Hellenistic era onwards, but I would say that Polemo indeed wraps them very well into a sort of very harmonious whole, where despite the obvious stereotype-based, to us insubstantial essence of that whole doctrine, it was in a way a plausible whole. But Polemo also constantly does things with gender. All of these, the Hellenicity, the animal axis, they can all be always also gendered. So for Polemo, the purely ideological, notional perfect physiognomy was lion-like, Greek-like, and masculine. And in a way, if we think about this as like a grid of coordinates in 3D with three axes, the origo, the notional center point of ideal is Hellenic, leonine, masculine, but of course nobody ever really feels this, because the diagnostic edge, the diagnostic potential of physiognomy always comes from deviating from it. Whether you deviate along the gender axis or the animal axis or the ethnic axis, you always can be placed somewhere, and that's where the physiognomist's power sort of comes. He takes the audience on this journey of discovering imposters, pulling away the curtain, showing the person's hidden qualities. It's an almost voyeuristic kind of hit, I would say, that the audience is getting. They are taken by the hand with this physiognomist. Come on, let's go and reveal what's the real deal with this individual. So it is intrinsically polemic, super performative. And I would say it also points out to this incredibly neurotic, performative maintaining of public image that is very typical to the 2nd century. Everybody was watched all the time. If you were elite man in the public sphere, you were painfully aware constantly of being watched. You would have constantly supervised your body for right way of walking, right way of gesturing, what expressions, what tones to use. And this partially would have probably led to very intensely gendered, normative ways of presenting yourself, which is part of, I would say, that is perhaps the less seldom spoken of part of second sophistic.
And we definitely find these leonine masculine ideals in Stoic philosophical texts also, and is reflected in a lot of the philosophical texts that are my personal research field.
Exactly. Yeah, I think it's actually got lots of kind of like aligned fields where it overlaps. It overlaps with medical knowledge for sure.
Definitely.
From my point of view, it overlaps with the ethnographical pool of knowledge. Philosophy comes very strongly into the fore in some authors. And then there is even maybe as a sort of little kind of almost vestigial, almost a fossil part of it is this kind of slightly oracular, slightly divination-like predictive angle. So the physiognomy got lots of supporting struts, as it were. It's kind of, despite its foolishness to us and how incredibly kind of biased it seems in its very foundations, it had lots of epistemic struts which kind of made it seem completely valid, which kind of, I suppose, explains why it is so seldom called into question. Even skeptics like Sextus Empiricus basically says there is possibility of making physiognomical predictions. He accepts it as well.
And he definitely gives a lot of ethnic stereotypical examples in his 10th mode of suspicion of judgment. And but perhaps this also kind of at least opens one's perspective on why physiognomy was so long-lived as a discipline and an art, because when we think about the long history of racializing thought, as well as long history of notions of gender, physiognomy as a theoretical framework and as an techne, as you said, has so multiple afterlives, and it was so persistent that it continued and influenced thinking in several eras and time periods after antiquity. Not only in the West, I think Polemo exactly is very telling example of how it influenced thinking also in the Arabic tradition. Would you
Absolutely,
agree?
absolutely. And that is actually the great benefit that came out from this 2007 volume by Simon Swain and others, published by Oxford University Press, Seeing the Face, Seeing the Soul, who, by comparing the Arabic reception, we basically have two Arabic recensions or versions of Polemo, one from Leiden, one from Istanbul, broadly speaking. They are probably from the 9th or 10th centuries originally, translations from the Greek, but it is only by seeing this Arabic reception that we can actually not only make a full reconstruction of what Polemo's physiognomy included, but also appreciate the strong afterlife of Polemo in the Arabic world, where his name was constantly being affixed onto physiognomical treatises. And this is kind of like, it is a separate reception history. In the West, Western reception relied quite strongly on a Latin translation, which was based broadly in Polemo, but which also had partially inherited pseudo-Aristotle's physiognomic Hellenistic treatise. This is kind of like the root of the Western tradition, which then, just like you said, has a very strong afterlife in the Renaissance. We have beautiful, handsomely illustrated volumes with different kinds of human faces, comparing especially with animals. And we even have a sort of 19th century afterlife for physiognomy in the shape of phrenology and Cesare Lombroso's early criminology, which is explicitly racializing and classist as well. It distinguishes and discriminates both on the basis of class and race. And there we had, of course, this influence of scientific knowledge in the era, which made it again seem more plausible that from the human skull shapes, etc., or indeed a person's physiognomy, you could read out their tendencies towards criminality or let's say somehow unconventional modes of life. And so yes, in a word, physiognomy has been coming back in certain waves for the past couple of millennia, really.
And it seems to be coming back now, because this morning actually, when I just got the idea of asking Google how Google would define physiognomy, because I'm interested in getting these popular images. So the artificial intelligence generated answer that you nowadays always get when you search for stuff explained that even though physiognomy is considered a pseudoscience, it is currently being used by artificial intelligence algorithms. So actually the AI confessed to me this morning that the AI is applying physiognomy. I don't know how and I don't know for what purpose, but I did think it was a rather interesting outcome.
That is a striking giveaway from AI. Indeed, I would be very interested in hearing how would it then further on justify this usage. I feel like we are indeed, again, with the culture becoming more visual, I would say, and with more scrutiny on the human bodies thanks to social media, etc., and in a way, despite some contrary trends towards accepting a wider body variation, etc., I think there is strong tendency for people to read the perfect body again, operate with this idea that there is a unitary perfect body which then can be read for signs of success, signs of stuff like that. So yeah, we might be again looking at a slightly different variation of physiognomy again.
Exactly, and I also came across quite a few recent studies which were analyzing from different points of view how images of people or characters who are associated with being Arabic or Muslims are much more likely to be represented in a negative way in TV serials or movies and giving the role of a villain and so on. So how kind of the characters are related to being a hero or a villain and so on.
Yeah, no, this is something quite interesting, and because my own research history has stemmed especially from studying ancient stereotypes about certain foreign religions, initially northern people's religions, but I have been looking at the Oriental pool of imagery as well quite a bit, and this is something which comes very strongly through from the ancient material and indeed any comparative material about stereotypes that we form about outgroups, groups which are not counting ourselves part of, is that we tend to always give more leeway for variety for our own in-group than the out-group. You know, you sometimes hear people say, oh, they are all like that, whether they are, I don't know, old people, people on the autistic spectrum, certain ethnic group, certain religious group. You know, we tend to always stereotype the out-group more narrowly. They are more like each other than our in-group, where we tend to usually grant much more internal variety to this. And this is strange, of course, but it seems something quite almost ineradicable, or at least very intrinsic to the human way of using stereotypes about population groups.
Yeah, I was intrigued by your analysis of the Oriental stereotypes in the volume Oriental Mirages that you co-edited with Björn Forsén that came out 2024. And there you have two articles in this volume, in both of which you are analyzing stereotypes of people from the East or Oriental people in the ancient materials. So I thought it was strikingly interesting, both for the topic of our conference in Málaga, but also for the conversation we are having. So could you just give like some examples of what types of stereotypes you find in your materials?
Well, loads is the short answer. But one thing, just, you know, because we have been speaking also about the kind of the utilitarian, the instrumental function in which stereotypes are being put in pursuit of all other kinds of agendas, whether rhetorical, political, populist or other things, and I think this is very relevant to the conference topic as well. What strikes me as particularly interesting is the way in which use of stereotypes tends to always find support from different kinds of knowledge frames or knowledge bases or theoretical frameworks, but the frameworks are really always there just to justify the maintaining, the maintenance, the continued use of these stereotypes. And this can, for instance, be illustrated by a couple of examples. On a personal level, as an individual stereotype use, we could, for instance, point out to the way in which the historian Cassius Dio, late 2nd century, 3rd century writer, he writes about Emperor Caracalla, not a figure that Cassius Dio highly appreciated. He is doing a little bit of a character assassination there. But Dio is writing that Caracalla had 3 bad ethnic influences. He had the 3 negative traits from 3 different regions or peoples, and the positive traits of none of these. From his father's side, he was African, because Septimius Severus was from Africa. And Cassius Dio says that hence Caracalla was harsh and cruel. These were stereotypes quite often associated with Africa in antiquity. From his mother's side, Julia Domna was a Syrian. So Cassius Dio says that from his mother's side, Caracalla got this deviousness that Syrians were very often stereotyped as. But what's interesting, well, this is in a way logical. From each parent he inherited something. But in order to round out his negative image of Caracalla, Cassius Dio then has this genethliacal, birth-related aspect to it. Because as it happens, Caracalla was born in Lugdunum, modern Lyon in France. So Caracalla is hence influenced by this pool of stereotypes about Gauls as well. Cassius Dio writes that from the Gallic side, Caracalla had inherited flightiness, or this kind of like untrustability, foolhardiness and cowardliness. So we have parental inheritance, but also a purely birth-based local Gallic inheritance, just in order to character assassinate a by now dead emperor who Dio was not very appreciative of. This is just one example of the polemic use of stereotypes. He did not need to explain any of these ethnic stereotypes. His audience would have automatically thought with them instead of against them. If we think about groups, well, one group which I'm talking in one of the chapters in the Oriental Mirages book is the Anatolian Celts, who we know as Galatai or the Galatians. They were in antiquity thought / known to have come from Europe, to be related to the continental Celts in Europe, and hence coming from the northern kind of pool of stereotypes. They were considered descendants of a northern group of barbarians. And it is very striking how in written sources, even within one source, let's say Livy, the Roman historian who wrote under Augustus, within his text, Livy very much takes opposite views about whether Galatians had changed in their new climate, because this is something which was very commonly an explanatory framework in antiquity, the role of climates and environments in certain regions over the peoples who lived in that area. This was one of the most popular and never questioned explanation models. And Livy is, on the other hand, claiming that the northern Galatians, having arrived in Anatolia and having lived in the more southerly climate, had somehow degenerated into Easterners. They had become effeminate, luxury-loving, all kinds of like softening had been happening. And then on the other hand, in other parts of his great work of history, Livy argues that these are still just the sort of northerners who Romans have been fighting hard against, and they are difficult opponents. So, you know, the convenience of being able to point out that either a person, in this case a group, are changed by the climate, or then suddenly they are not changed by the climate. Both options were available for an author, and the actual concrete manifestation of how this would have happened, how does the mental or the physical, or both in conjunction, characteristics of the people are changed by the climate, this was never really strongly and well articulated. It is again functioning on the basis of everyday stereotypes. Indeed, when Livy describes a Roman battle against the Anatolian Galatai, it's interesting that he describes that the Galatians, because broadly speaking, as a background, northern peoples in antiquity were often thought to be overly moist in this kind of regime of 4 bodily humors. They were thought to be characterized by overly much moisture in their bodies. They were large, pale, flabby, and quite aggressive and non-intellectual. So Livy is saying essentially that fighting in the Anatolian summer heat, these originally northern Galatians, who by then had been living in modern-day Turkey for several generations, their bodies still somehow react to this southern heat in a purely northern way. They get flustered, they get sweaty, their power and bravery flags very soon. So it's very funny that in a way the bodies of the Galatians have not gotten the memo in here. They have certainly degenerated in mental terms into Easterners, but their bodies nonetheless respond in a very northern way to the southern climate. Once again, demonstrating the purely instrumental function for this kind of theories and how to deploy them.
And that's exactly what I wanted to ask next, because, well, first of all, many of the stereotypes that you also analyze are, for me at least, quite recognizable even today. So there is the interesting aspect of like why stereotypes are so long-lived, why they are so persistent. And I have one nice quotation from your article explaining the East, forming and applying Eastern stereotypes in the Greco-Roman tradition, where you write, what often would have influenced their stereotypes' continued survival was the correspondence of these stories with the already established ideas about the Orient. This is how the psychology of stereotyping works. Evidence going against an already established stereotype will either need to accumulate to a significant degree, or else the information exchange needs to take place in the particularly close or dramatic circumstances for there to be any chance of the received pool of stereotypical imagery to be overturned. So I was wondering, like, is this kind of one way of explaining why the stereotypes are so long-lived and so persistent in the ancient materials?
I would say it is one way of explaining it, and remarkably long-winded way. I mean, when quoted my own text back to myself, I realized what a long-winded way I have of saying things. But yes, basically that is exactly true. There are several things to this, of course. Partially it is to do with the way human cognitive processes work with stereotypes. It seems that especially when the stereotype is negative, lots more examples need to go against it for it to change. A positive stereotype seems to be able to change into negative stereotype more easily than a negative stereotype into positive one in almost every studied context. In the modern era, we can only postulate that this probably would have been the same way in antiquity as well. But there are a couple of reasons, yes, as to this very long life of stereotypes. Now, in ancient literature, and maybe ancient spoken communication as well, there is a remarkable traditionality in some ways. In literature especially, it was just suitable usually to keep using the same names about populations, the same qualities that they had been presented to have previously. There's indeed, I would say there's three interlocked questions in here. One might be called the impossibility of new barbarians. The second one might be called the vanishing middle. And the third one might be called saving the phenomena. The impossibility of new barbarians actually has got much to do with this environmental determinism and the explanations from nature and the state of affairs and climates. Because the way Greeks and Romans tended to think about populations was that quite irrespective to what these peoples would have been calling themselves, that really did not matter to the Greeks and Romans. If they came from the same area and hence being influenced by the same climates, soils, weather phenomena, they were almost always interpreted to be just different kinds of manifestations of the same people. A very typical example, often quoted example, are the peoples from the northern Black Sea area, what was known from Archaic era onwards as Scythia. Now, when we enter late antiquity and we have lots of different peoples coming from there, Yazyges, Goths, Herulians, Huns, Pechenegs in the Byzantine era, they tend all to be called in our written sources Scythians, because they come from Scythia. It really didn't matter what they call themselves, they are just different flavors of Scythian, because they come from the same climate, same environment. So that is the so-called impossibility of new barbarians. New barbarians in some ways did not exist to the Romans. It was more important that there were certain kinds of barbarians than what kind were they actually, I would say. The second one is the so-called vanishing middle, which to my understanding applies to all kinds of ethnographical descriptions really in many eras. Is the fact that when we describe foreign societies, especially if they are spatially long, like in terms of space or chronological distance or social distance far away from us, we tend to discard that kind of phenomena or that kind of descriptions which would be quite similar to us. Of course, sometimes you find familiarizing exercises. You sometimes say, these people do the same thing as we do. But this basically usually does not make for a very good narrative or very gripping, interesting, kind of titillating narrative, which would be like, really grabbing the attention of the audience. What grabs the attention of the audience is difference. And the more extreme the customs, the more worth of repeating them is. So the middle that vanishes here are these myriad everyday ways in which actually these people does things exactly in the same way as everybody else. So we have in kind of like an emphasis on the weirdness often in ethnography. Also, concurrently with this one, we tend to, just like I mentioned earlier, we tend to think about foreign groups all more homogeneous than our own group. So, we often get, even nowadays, we get phrases like, oh, group X does Z. Or, as we all know, group NN thinks Y. So we, whether this group is, I don't know, Jehovah's Witnesses or any religious group, or let's say Finnish people, we tend to stereotype in these blocks. And these together also definitely functioned in antiquity. Now the third one I mentioned is the so-called preserving the phenomenon, which actually in different kinds of scholarship can mean various things. But in studying ancient ethnography, it has been often used as this kind of like help in thinking of the ways in which the ancient Greco-Roman tradition really does not want to let go of a good story when it's entered the tradition. So, especially about, well, let's take my favorite example, which I have also studied the longest, the continental Celts, the Gauls, which were known to the Greeks, then were enemies of the Romans for many centuries, slowly conquered by the Romans, and then became Gallic provincials for many, many centuries. And all these many centuries that the Gallic peoples are under Roman rule, we tend to get, again, the same interesting stories being narrated about their human sacrifice or their ridiculous outfits or their bravery in war or their habit of cutting off human heads after battle, etc. Obviously, centuries after these customs had finished, there was no trace of them, or indeed mentions of their druids and their strange and fascinating beliefs about the afterlife. And this is retaining the phenomena, saving the phenomena, because they make the story much better, and audience wouldn't really have been much interested in hearing that the Gallic provincials are exactly like us. Instead, what they want to hear is this trouser-wearing, mustachioed, warlike, brave, weirdly thinking Galatians who keep on lopping human heads off. And these all kind of three different aspects are at least some of the explanation behind this very long-lived pool of stereotypes.
I would finally like to ask you, because one of the kind of key questions that me and Tomás Pacheco-Bethencourt were interested in when organizing this seminar is precisely how ancient scholarship or classical perspective can help us to shed light and open new perspectives on ongoing phenomena of stereotypes and polarization and so on. And obviously we are living in an era in populist rhetoric and political debates and social media full of stereotypical images and so on. So what do you think could be some ways how scholarship on on ancient stereotypes and ancient materials can help us to analyze what is happening in the world today?
That's a massively important question, and one that I think about regularly. As somebody who would like to see classics and ancient history retain its importance for generations to come, not because it's special in any way, not because it's somehow objectively more valuable for culture in this world than any other tradition, but because we need to understand the basis of the idealization and the value basis which, for instance, governed the period of Western history of ideas, which saw large-scale slavery, the birth of capitalism, imperialism, colonialism, this and massively elitistic field in itself. And I'm very preoccupied by a way, by finding the ways in which we can find and construct a fair, inclusive, global view of looking at ancient history, not from a Greco-centric or Romanocentric or Eurocentric point of view, but one that seeks to understand and portray in a transparent, open and inclusive way also the more negative aspects of the classical reception, neither demonizing nor apologizing for the way classics or ancient history was, but perhaps seeking to understand and reveal the ways it has been used in the subsequent centuries. And I genuinely do think that we are living in an era when discriminatory rhetoric, the use of stereotypes in a blatantly agenda-driven, politicized way is rife, driven by very savvy and successful right-wing influencers, nativists, racists, fascists, who unfortunately are able to dictate the terms of the conversation as well at the moment, which then the largely spineless center ground of the politics keeps on adopting and following, and hence driving itself towards the right wing as well. So we need to find ways to speak about the ancient material and make it clear that just like this discriminatory rhetoric and stereotypical use from a populist point of view, exclusionary point of view, racist and nativist point of view, and in antiquity, just like it was absolutely agenda-driven and morally wrong back then, so it is now today, that there is actually no new techniques being used by the right-wing rhetoric these days, that we have the same kind of false equivalencies, nativism, emotional rhetoric being used, in-group, out-group exacerbation, and this all has been seen for millennia now. There is nothing new in this. It is equally harmful. It is indeed propagated much more efficiently thanks to social media and the current interrelatedness of the medias, but as such there is nothing new to it. And I do hope that by studying indeed discrimination, exclusionary rhetoric as a transhistorical phenomenon, as a chain of utterances which has its own reception but has also its own contextually definable manifestations, I feel like this might come a long way towards not only finding a role for classics in explaining the ancient world and its inheritance, but certainly also responding to this monumental challenge that is facing humanities, and indeed just the act of being human and treating others as human beings as well.
Well, I certainly think that your topics are extremely topical in the world right now, so we are extremely happy to have you here in Malaga. Thank you so much, Antti, and it was a pleasure having this conversation with you.
Thank you, Malin. It's always both meaningful and pleasant, despite the unpleasant subject matter. It's always wonderful and stimulating to talk about these things with you.
Thank you.
Cheers.